My name's Ruth Darlene, and I'm the founder and executive director of a program that's called Women of Silicon Valley, WomenSV. And this is a program that I created back in 2011 to address some hidden victims in our population. The focus is on more subtle forms of abuse, like emotional, financial, legal, technological, and this type of abuse that doesn't always leave bruises or broken bones behind, but can still be dangerous and even deadly nonetheless. So our survivors tend to be involved with powerful, sophisticated abusers, and you'd have no idea that they have this other dark side that usually only their wives and children ever see behind closed doors, as in the book title. So I'm so happy to be here with you today talking about this issue because it's described so expertly in that novel, so expertly, in fact, one wonders, is there a reason why only the initials were used in the author's name? Was it too close to home to identify herself as more than by her initials? The mission of WomenSV is to empower survivors, train providers, and educate the community so that we can end up breaking the cycle of covert abuse and coercive control in intimate partner relationships. And don't worry if you don't have a real strong handle on what those terms mean. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. But our vision is a world in which every woman and every child, every man, woman, and child for that matter, can exercise their fundamental human right to live in peace and safety and freedom in their own home. So, as I said, we were founded back in 2011, and we got our start from the Los Altos Community Foundation. I will forever be indebted to our beloved Roy Lave, who passed away recently. He was the founder and executive director of Los Altos Community Foundation, and he was the one who said yes to my program and gave me a start as my first fiscal sponsor. And then WomenSV became its own independent 501c3 back in 2017. And over the past 12 years, we've served over 14 survivors. A few more than 1,400 survivors of covert abuse and coercive control. So we don't charge for our services because, for two reasons, really. One, because we believe it's everybody's right to live in freedom and safety in your home, and you shouldn't have to pay to exercise that right. But also because of the severe financial abuse that so many of our survivors are experiencing. On paper, it might look like their household income is more than sufficient, but unfortunately, many of them don't have access to that income because of the financial abuse they've been exposed to. So that's why, because we don't charge for our services, we rely on donations to keep our program going. And then we are politically neutral. We don't side with any party, any cause, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whatever affiliation you have. Everybody is welcome in our program. And we are just very blessed with the partnerships we have, because in doing this work, you can imagine we've created some enemies along the way, and I'll say more about that later. But we are blessed to have a number of very powerful partnerships with people that use their power for good purposes, because that's if we can all agree that most men, most women are people of good character and good conscience, and what we're talking about today here are the outliers. So we rely heavily on building our own village with people that use their power for good purposes. So just a few caveats before I really dive in. I am a teacher by training. I was an English teacher back in the day. I'm a big fan of Dickens, who got paid by the word, but I'll try to be more succinct today. But I'm also a trained domestic violence advocate with the California State Certification in Domestic Violence Advocacy. And today I'm going to be I want to say, even though I'm not an attorney or a therapist, I do trainings for therapists and for attorneys, because they receive so little training on domestic violence, for one, but also covert abuse and coercive control. So this population that I'm serving is a small subset of the professional population, and as I said, let's just put it out there that most people in this bracket are people of good conscience and good character. But what we're dealing with here are the outliers, the one that use the camouflage of their image and their education and their credentials to hide their dark behavior. I also want to acknowledge that abuse crosses all boundaries. It doesn't matter what gender you are, what race you are, what socioeconomic level you come from. Anybody can be a victim of this type of abuse, and anybody can be a perpetrator. So I'll tell you some stories because I'm Irish and I can't help it, but I will also be changing the names and some of the details to protect not only the innocent but the guilty as I share some stories with you. I do want to acknowledge, too, that men can be victims of covert abuse and women can be perpetrators. And women as parents in particular can be perpetrators of coercive control over their children. But looking at the Department of Justice statistics, because 85 to 95% of domestic violence survivors or victims are female, and that's my area of expertise. When you hear me talk about perpetrator today, I'll be using the pronoun he. And when I talk about a victim or survivor, I'll use the pronoun she. But it's just to acknowledge that anybody can be a perpetrator, anybody can be a victim of domestic abuse. And then what I'll be sharing with you today are stories, not so much data, because there's little data and little clinical research that's been done in this field. I know the one other clinical researcher in the country, Megan Hasselschwart, who is doing research on this population. But we have this idea that domestic violence doesn't happen in more educated areas, and that has impacted the funding for this kind of research. Because where do we get the statistics? We get them from police stations and domestic violence agencies and hospitals, the very places where women from this demographic tend not to go to when they are experiencing abuse. Or even if they do show up at a hospital, they aren't always at liberty to be accurate and honest about the way they sustained their wounds. So there's 3 parts to our program. The first is educating survivors and combining that with safety planning to address all the risks and threats of being involved with a covert abuser. Our survivors come from all different races, all countries, religions, and cultural backgrounds. It's amazing to see women who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s. 86 is the age of our oldest survivor, and she calls herself still a hot tomato. But she's amazing. But to see all of these women of all different generations and races all coming together as sisters, bound together by this common experience, being involved with a powerful, sophisticated abuser, it's really a joy and an honor to have them all gathered in the same Zoom room together. And then the second thing that we do is we provide trainings for the professionals in the world, doctors, therapists, attorneys, court staff, to help them become more educated in this area, and so they can be more trauma informed in serving the survivors they interact with that come from this demographic. And then the third thing we do, the third part of our program, is public presentations like what we're doing here today. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's really an honor to be invited to talk to your book club. And I hope that after today, from some of the things I hope you'll learn from my talk today, that you'll share what you've learned with your friends, your family members, and just keep spreading the word. So it's the ripple effect, the butterfly effect that I hope we'll engage in today. So we also, I do interviews for the media, and I do a lot of public presentations, and have been writing a column for our local newspaper, the Town Crier. So what are the professional backgrounds that our survivors come from? Here's some samples here. Engineers, doctors, professors, lawyers, psychologists, entrepreneurs, CEOs, religious leaders, celebrities. I'm working with a Hollywood actress right now whose abusive partner is a very famous producer and was responsible for her ending up in jail. So this happens no matter what income or career or a professional privilege you might have, and even on stay-at-home parents. And what are their parents? What are their abusive partners? What professions do they come from? Similar professions, the same professions. Their abusive partners are also engineers, doctors, professors, lawyers, psychologists, therapists, entrepreneurs, CEOs, religious leaders, celebrities, stay-at-home parents. And isn't it even worse when you think about doctors and therapists and religious leaders engaging in this kind of abusive behavior? Hiding behind that public image. It's a betrayal of their oath, isn't it, to serve and protect the others. So some examples of where I've done trainings and presentations, Google X, Oracle, the Megyn Kelly Today Show back in the day when it was on, Good Morning America. I've been in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I've done trainings for the probation department in Santa Clara County and even down in Orange County. Last fall, I did a training for judges across the state of California. I presented at the annual Domestic Violence Conference in Santa Clara County multiple times. I'm going to be doing that again this fall. And I'll also be presenting at our Sunnyvale City Council meeting as they get ready to proclaim October Domestic Violence Awareness Month. This is, if you get a chance to go online and look at the Los Altos Town Crier online, you'll see some of my columns under either Ruth Patrick or Ruth Darlene. And just in terms of more exposure and outreach, we were really privileged to receive an award for community service from the San Jose Mercury News. And they honored one of our advocates, Sandy Harvey, who has her own story to tell. And she was on the Megyn Kelly Show with me as a survivor of horrific coercive control that ended up in taking the lives of not just her husband, but her 5-year-old son. Who committed murder-suicide and took the one thing that meant the most in her life away from her. So Sandy has made meaning out of that tragedy by becoming an advocate herself and spreading the word about the lethality risk of covert abuse and coercive control. There were no broken bones or bruises to show for her suffering. And back in the day, like 25, 30 years ago, they didn't have language to put on this kind of abusive behavior. But now we do. And now it's everybody's mission, and I hope you'll take it as your own personal mission to keep spreading the word, because you could save a life. We're really blessed to have the recognition of so many different agencies that have honored our work and helped us get the word out. And as a result of all this exposure, we get calls from all around the country now, from all over the country, and in some cases from different parts of the world, because they've exhausted local resources that focus on physical and sexual violence. We do address those, but we also really focus heavily on the more subtle forms of abuse, and that's what's lacking in the general support that survivors are receiving today. Demographic breakdown of the survivors that we serve. That, as I said, how wonderful to see all the different generations that come together, gathered under one Zoom roof, and where they come from. Yes, still the bulk of the survivors we serve from Santa Clara County, but we also serve ladies and survivors from San Mateo County and from different parts of the country. Yeah, as I said, over the past 12 years, working with over 1,400 survivors, and we serve roughly 200 survivors a year individually. That is going to change going forward, because we realize that the more staff we hire, the more survivors are reaching out for help. It's a never-ending battle of trying to serve almost an infinite number of survivors reaching out for support, but then entering or re-entering the same systems that have are supposed to be protecting them, but end up unintentionally or inadvertently re-victimizing them because they don't understand the risks and challenges of covert abuse and coercive control. So that's why going forward, there's more and more of a push at WomenSV to educate the systems that our survivors are entering, the court staff, attorneys, physicians, therapists, law enforcement. So here's some troubling statistics as we dive in here, that 1 in 3 women on the planet will be raped or beaten during her lifetime. 1 in 3 women on the planet. And that's not even addressing the more subtle forms of abuse that we focus on.
Wow.
So imagine how prevalent it is in the world. And we know that 1 in 5 college women will be a victim of intimate partner violence. That's what IPV stands for, during her college years. But did you know that 1 in 5 women we know generally will be a victim of sexual assault? That's kind of a generally known statistic. But also 1 in 5 college women will be a victim of intimate partner violence in her dating relationships during college years. IPV, intimate partner violence, is a leading cause of injury amongst women. It's one of the leading causes of death amongst pregnant women in the form of a homicide. And I know that all too well because I serve on the domestic violence death review team. And over a third of women who are seeking help for injuries at the ER are there for domestic violence injuries. And unfortunately, physicians are not receiving sufficient training to distinguish between what's an accident and what's an abusive injury. And isn't this troubling? About 50% of homicides go unsolved every year. So if a woman ends up getting killed by her partner, he's got a 50-50 chance of getting away with it. And domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness amongst women. So very, very troubling what's going on in our world today. Still, though we've made so much progress, we have a long way to go. We have this idea that domestic violence, abuse, doesn't happen in the nicer parts of town, but here's the truth. We're just better at hiding it. Survivors in this demographic tend not to reach out to the places I talked about for help, like hospitals and DV agencies and the police, the agencies that keep track of this kind of data. So they are basically a hidden, marginalized population. And even if they do talk to somebody about needing help, sometimes they're met with prejudice, you and your champagne problems, especially if they don't have broken bones or bruises to show for it. And then there's this perception that they should have the financial resources at their disposal to take care of any problems that they have. And that's simply not the case for the overwhelming majority of our survivors. They've been ruined financially by their partners. So I'm grateful to Susan Weitzman, who was on the Megyn Kelly show with me as one of the experts who was being consulted on that hour-long show dedicated to abuse in affluent areas. She wrote a book. She's a clinical psychologist, and she wrote a book called Not to People Like Us, based on her practice. That might be another book for your book club, but Hidden Abuse in Upscale Marriages. It's a fascinating book, and it's the only other book I know of, other than the one I'm writing, that's focused on this demographic. And she says in her book that the more money that their partners had, the more afraid they were of ending up getting killed by their partner. So, and there's so much shame and social stigma attached to this issue and this demographic. It's very, very hard for women to reach out for help because they think, I'm so successful in all these other areas of my life. How is it I'm not making this part of my life work? And the problem is, it's not her problem to solve. She didn't cause it. She can't fix it. It's a character issue. It's the type of person that she inadvertently fell in love with because they were so good at impression management. Anybody can fall victim to this type of person because they're so charming. Mm. Domestic violence, the dynamics are pretty much the same no matter what socioeconomic area you come from. It's just that the more power and money and influence you have, the more tools you have at your disposal to wield that power and control. Think about the book Behind Closed Doors with the protagonist married to this important, successful attorney who's making his living doing what? Defending survivors of domestic violence. What a champion for a wonderful cause. Mm-hmm. And how much better you can hide behind that kind of camouflage. Who would ever believe that he would have this dark side and something going on in the basement? So that's how these guys get away with it. They use their education and their credentials and their public image for camouflage. And they can make it very hard for a woman to escape, to maintain any kind of reasonable standard of living comparable to what she had before, even to avoid ending up in bankruptcy or poverty or even homelessness. I do have ladies that have been couch surfing or staying in shelters. And these are ladies who once lived in very upper class neighborhoods, but were completely financially ruined by their partners. So hard for them to stay safe, hard for them to keep custody of their children, hard for them to carry on with anything like a normal life going forward. So here's the image that we often have about what domestic violence looks like, and this is what's shared by traditional domestic violence agencies, and it does a good job of starting to get at coercive control, aspects of coercive control that are described in these middle sections of the pie chart, the dynamics of power and control as they're expressed in things like intimidating, threatening, coercing behavior, and that economic control, the financial abuse that I was talking about, verbal abuse, isolating her. These are all aspects of coercive control. It doesn't cover the whole picture. And the fact that it's surrounded by the circumference of the wheel is physical abuse and sometimes sexual abuse. That can be misleading with women that are trapped in an abusive relationship that involves more subtle forms of abuse. Sometimes you'll just get the midsection without physical abuse, or it may only happen one time, but he only ever has to put his hands on you once for it to be ever hanging in the air as a possibility forever after that. You know what could happen if you step out of line. But you don't ever have to lay hands on someone to threaten them, to control them, to isolate them, to tell them that if you ever leave me, I will hunt you down. I will take the children. You will be a bag lady. You will have nothing. And that's happened to so many of our ladies. Why do they stay? The question is, how do they ever get the courage to leave?
Where do they get sleeping pills?
I'm sorry? What was that?
I was being funny. I said, and where do they get the sleeping pills? I was being funny.
Aha. You know that most domestic violence happens, the acts of domestic violence, over 70% happen after the woman ends the relationship. And yeah, not all of us have access to sleeping pills, right? But just to take a moment to talk about that, often a truth spoken in jest, that how do women escape the inescapable? And sometimes women end up getting horrific illnesses. And I have survivors who've ended up with cancer, heart disease. Some are in the end stages of those diseases with no history of those diseases in their family. But I'll tell you, ongoing abuse, covert abuse, coercive control, living in that atmosphere of threat will take a terrible toll on your immune system. If you ever go to an oncologist and get diagnosed with cancer, one of the things they'll ask you is, have you been under significant stress in the last year or two? And that's what our survivors are living with. And so, and then sometimes they die from illnesses. Sometimes they die through other kinds of natural causes. Sometimes they die through accidents. I have a woman that was forced to drive a car with faulty brakes for a year. Her husband was too cheap to get those brakes replaced, but also was CEO of a large company with owning millions himself. Why would he force his wife to drive around like that? And so there are accidents that happen. There are women who end up giving up on life. Sometimes they want to slip those sleeping pills to their partner to find a way to escape, and sometimes they end up taking them themselves. Sometimes they end up medicating themselves with prescription drugs or alcohol as a way to just dull the pain for a while. And when those women end up dead, I don't call that suicide. I don't call that death by natural causes. I call that the long, slow murder. And it's the perfect crime because it leaves no forensic evidence behind. We had a woman who was married to a physician, and she had a life-threatening allergy to a certain food. And somehow, accidentally, after she told her husband she wanted a divorce, that food ended up in her dinner that night. And she was going into anaphylactic shock. This is a woman married to a physician who wouldn't let her call 911. He said, "Oh, let's not wait for the ambulance to arrive. Time is of the essence. Let me drive you to the ER." So they get in the car, and he's traveling 5 miles an hour, stopping at every, not orange or red light, every green light, just to be on the safe side. Now, should she have died on the way to the hospital, what would have been the cause of death? Anaphylactic shock through the jumbo shrimp she'd ingested? Or would you now know the true cause, medical negligence by a physician who knew better and was hoping that time would be on his side so that he would look like the rescuer, saving his wife, doing his best to outrun an ambulance by getting her there himself, but while driving 5 miles an hour all the way. She survived, but not all of them do. Talk about a staged homicide. It's not somebody that's, that dies from a gunshot wound and it's made to look like she pointed the gun at herself. Much more subtle, much more covert, much more sophisticated than that. And then we have the periods of peace where he's not being abusive, or maybe he gives her flowers or remembers her birthday or their anniversary for a change. And it's those periods of peace that raise that hope in her again, where maybe he'll go back to being the man that I fell in love with. But over time, if she starts to keep a journal, a record of what the abuse and that inevitable shoe that drops looks like, over time she may see that pattern emerge and realize that even those periods of peace and calm, that's just part of the cycle of abuse, that control that keeps her coming back into the relationship and staying there with him. It's not always a pattern like this that emerges. Sometimes it's abuse all the time. Sometimes there's periods of peace, and then she'll just say something like, oh, mention that the dishwasher broke that day, and then that'll set them off immediately without any tension building. So there's different patterns that emerge. But what ultimately the common denominator is having her home turned into a battlefield. Just like what happened to our protagonist in Behind Closed Doors. Her home was anything but a home, anything but a sanctuary. Her home was a prison, even with the garden wall around it so no one could peek in, right? And God forbid she should make a mistake if dinner for the guests should not be perfect, because she would end up where? Yeah, in the red room, in the basement. And how could she reach out to anybody for help? Because he'd done such a great job of poisoning the waters, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. But coercive control, as I said, doesn't always leave broken bones or bruises behind to show for it. And that's why it's so vital to consider the totality of the circumstances. What does the pattern look like? Imagine if you're stargazers, any of you, and you go out at night, maybe you recognize a star or a planet here or there. But over time, if you start to study the night skies, don't you start to see the Big Dipper and it just pops out at you? You can't unsee it over time as you put that pattern together. You connect the dots. And that's what has to happen in covert abuse and coercive control. Because otherwise it's a one-off. Oh yeah, he cut off somebody when we were on the highway. Oh, he was rude to the server in the restaurant. Oh, he made me question whether or not I was capable enough to go back to work or go for that job promotion. Oh, he interrupted me and cut me off and made fun of me when we had guests over the other night. Are these one-off stars in the night sky, or is a constellation emerging over time? And that's what you have to be, a detective in your own life, to put those clues together so that you emerge with that final picture of what the constellation is. And this is the one that forms the constellation called the covert abuser that now you see. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the challenge is getting other people to see that same constellation, not those individual stars in the night sky. That's what they're up against. So it's a pattern of threatening, isolating, controlling behaviors. And it can range, covert abuse and coercive control can range from everything from gaslighting, getting inside her head and making her doubt her perception of what happened or what he said or how she reacted, making her question her reality over time and perhaps even her sanity. It can range from that all the way to non-fatal and even fatal strangulation. And I'll tell you, over 40% of our women SV survivors have experienced non-fatal strangulation at the hands of their partner. Non-fatal strangulation at the hands of their doctor, lawyer, CEO, therapist, religious leader, partner. How mind-boggling is that? For them to experience, for them to explain, and for them to get support around. Because how can we wrap our mind around that kind of evil? And that's how they get away with it. Just like in Behind Closed Doors, everybody thought he was such a charming, wonderful guy and a champion of the underdog and of poor women that are these poor, lovely, beautiful souls who are being trapped in these relationships with horrible monsters, not realizing that the champion of this cause was a monster himself. That's how they get away with it. Because how can we hold those two images in our head at the same time? Are you Dr. Jekyll? But can you also be Mr. Hyde? How can you be both at the same time? We see one or the other. You're good or evil. And with these covert abusers, that's how they get away with it, because we can only see Dr. Jekyll, and only she sees, and her children often, Mr. Hyde. And another thing they do is this micromanagement of everyday activities, like controlling and ordering and punishing her around like basic household tasks, like how she cooks dinner. Remember the dinner parties, and Behind Closed Doors, how everything had to be perfectly orchestrated, perfectly presented, or there would be hell to pay afterwards. So the way she raises the children, or keeps the house, or cooks the food, everything over time comes under this label of micromanagement. One of our ladies called it, her relationship was crime and punishment. What is she going to do today that's going to set him off? And they often keep raising the bar or changing the rules. And how crazy making is that today's dinner is fine, and you make the same dinner next week and he throws it on the floor. And with one of our ladies, he forced her to eat it. Just terrible, terrible things that they do to their partners, and all behind closed doors. And going back in time to the way women were treated in the old days, it was all behind closed doors, and it was a private matter. And where we get the expression rule of thumb is that you weren't allowed to beat your wife with a stick that was thicker than the width of your thumb. So we've come a long way, baby, but we still have a long way to go. So I call covert abuse, or it is called a liberty crime. Evan Stark calls it a liberty crime in his book, Coercive Control, How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life. There's another book for your book club. It's kind of thick, heavy reading. If you start in the middle and then read the rest, I think it becomes a page turner. But it's a liberty crime because it impinges on our basic fundamental human right to live in peace and safety and freedom in our personal life, in our homes and outside our homes in the workplace. So it's also, I call it, the ultimate form of identity theft because it robs her of her freedom, of her safety, of her independence, of her self-esteem, of her happiness, of her sense of self, of who she was before getting into this type of relationship. It involves treating women and children like objects, like possessions, like resources to use and use up and then even dispose of if they cause trouble or get in the way. And that's why covert abuse and coercive control are lethality risks, because what's the ultimate right of possession? Disposal. It's what happened to Gabby Petito, who was, by the way, strangled to death. So how do we tell what a covert abuser looks like? Well, the key is in the name, covert. You can't tell by looking. Look at all these men here in this Hall of Shame, the Rogues Gallery. All of them were found to have committed domestic violence. And many on the bottom row committed the ultimate act. Actually, some on the top row. I should organize them better. Next, some on the top and some on the bottom. Dr. Martin McNeil, we'll talk about him in a moment. Bob Bashara, George Hughley V, Scott Peterson, O.J. Brian Laundrie. Everybody on the top row committed the ultimate act of domestic violence. So did Ed Dow, wealthy developer in Los Gatos, who ended up killing his son and himself. He would beat his wife for buying a new dress or putting highlights in her hair. She had a restraining order against him and was afraid of what would happen to her, even with the restraining order in effect. And it's only a piece of paper, and it didn't prevent her husband from killing their son and himself. Bob Bashara, president of the Rotary Club, paid his handyman to kill his wife. And physician, Dr. Martin McNeil. More about him in a moment. So if we can't tell an abuser, can we tell what a survivor looks like, or a victim of domestic violence? And the reason why I say what does an abuse survivor or victim look like is frankly because not all of them survive. Gabby Petito did not survive. Diane Craig did not survive. Lacey Peterson, remember Lacey? Did not survive. Pregnancy, a homicide risk if you're with an abusive partner. Yardley Love, young, beautiful Yardley Love, champion lacrosse player, college graduate, about to be murdered by her college boyfriend. Carmen Dow, the wife of the wealthy developer I told you about, being comforted by her daughter. And then on the bottom row here, Neha Rastogi, whose husband beat her and threatened her life. Look, here's another survivor of covert abuse and coercive control. And you know who this is? Senator Susan Rubio. And I'll say more about her in a moment, but she is the driving force behind Senate bill, a Senate bill that became Family Code 6320. That's all about coercive control, what I've been focused on for the past 12 years. So Rihanna, after one of her encounters with Chris Brown.
Football player, right?
Yeah, the football. Yeah. So, and then here's another book for your book club. Lots of suggestions today, but Crazy Love, written by Leslie Morgan Steiner. She has a YouTube video you can watch. Domestic violence survivor, Harvard grad, successful businesswoman, journalist, and survivor of domestic violence, Leslie Morgan Steiner. And here's Evan Rachel Wood, famous Hollywood movie star, and one of the other driving forces behind the Senate bill that became Family Code 6320. Because she's a coercive control survivor herself.
Wow.
So why victim versus survivor? Because not all of them survive. Alessandra Beatty was in Santa Clara County and about to enroll in nursing school when she was murdered by her boyfriend. And actually, the police chief at the time in San Jose tried to get to pursue the mission that her family had afterwards of creating an offender registry that would publicize the names of serial domestic violence offenders, and wasn't able to get it off the ground in Santa Clara County, but was able to get it off the ground in Texas. So we still have a ways to go in order to...
That's a surprise.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that. Yeah. And then here, remember I mentioned Dr. Martin McNeil with his lovely wife, Michelle McNeil, and this was turned into a Netflix series where he actually drugged his wife with drugs that would make it look like she died from natural causes. And he used to brag to his mistress that he could kill someone and make it look like they died from natural causes. And when he was found guilty of murder, one of the comments that his daughter made was, "We're just so happy that he can't hurt anyone else." He ended up committing suicide in prison, by the way. And closer to home here, we have Leonid Yamberg and his beautiful wife Svetlana. Svetlana did not survive, and neither did her 11-year-old daughter. This engineer who turned himself in to the Sunnyvale police station, saying that, confessing that he killed his wife, and what the police found when they went to the home was also their deceased 11-year-old daughter. So who are these covert abusers? It's the therapist who gets inside his partner's head to try to convince her that she's the crazy one, or convince police that she is having another one of her psychotic episodes when she's reaching out for help. It's the CEO who hides his income and forges his wife's signature on the income tax return. Out in the business world, we have terms like embezzlement and money laundering, but what do you call it when it happens in a marriage, when they violate that contract of fiduciary duty? It's the cybersecurity expert who puts a hidden camera in the shower head or in the charging brick of her phone, or follows her every move, stalking her and making her feel like he's omniscient, omnipresent. And when she tries to explain to people that he knows her every waking move and a conversation with everybody, doesn't she end up looking paranoid? It's the doctor who terrorizes his wife by telling her how he's going to kill her, and everybody will think she died from natural causes. And it's the journalist who mounts a smear campaign to destroy the reputation and character and career of their partner. So any profession can be used for good or ill purposes. So here's the thing to keep in mind. This is what I attended a conference at the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, and here's what Reed Malloy, a forensic psychologist who has expertise in psychopaths, said: even a seasoned professional can be fooled by a seasoned liar. And that's what these other quotes are all about too. So don't think because he's a doctor that or a therapist or a religious leader that he's automatically a person of good character. Let's still say that most of them are, but that's how the bad guys get away with it. Don't be swayed by credentials. So tactics of the covert abuser: setting her up to get arrested, keeping her up all night, and then making her do something where she reaches out to defend herself, and then he scratches himself or slaps himself and then calls the police, and he's got a red mark. She doesn't have wounds, and it's in California mandatory arrest policy where she could end up being slapped in handcuffs and put in jail. It happens. especially if she's let the cat out of the bag and told him her plans, that she wants a divorce and she knows California is a community property state and she's entitled to 50% of whatever income they've earned while they've been married. You let all those cats out of the bag, you're looking for trouble with a covert abuser who's going to show you who's in control. And many of our ladies have ended up on a psychiatric hold too, and especially at the hands of their physician husband or therapist husband who convinces the police that she's having another one of her psychotic breakdowns. When she's reaching out for help, he gets there first, and then he goes to visit her, and she says, "Why did you do that?" And you know what he says? "Because I can." And it's abuse by proxy, like where they... I don't know if you've heard the term flying monkeys, where covert abusers will enlist the support of mutual friends and colleagues and neighbors, and they will start planting seeds of doubt. First they'll say, "I love my wife so much, but I'm starting to get worried about her. She looks like she might be having a mental health issue and doesn't spend as much time with the children," or "I found an empty bottle of whiskey and it was out there, like just out in plain view, and horrible things are happening and I'm having to do all the work around the house now." None of this may be true, but planting these seeds... Yeah, that's what happened with our hero in Behind Closed Doors too, where she was made to look like she was the problem, and he enlisted the help of all their common friends to make her think that she had no avenue of support or escape. So here's what Judith Herman, who wrote the book, here's another book suggestion, Trauma and Recovery. In order to escape accountability, she's a psychiatrist who focuses on sexual trauma and abuse and healing from that. In order to escape accountability for his crimes, the perpetrator does everything in his power to promote forgetting. If secrecy fails, the perpetrator attacks the credibility of his victim. If he cannot silence her absolutely, he tries to make sure no one listens. And what better way to do that than to convince everybody that she's crazy or, she's the problem herself. And look at the harm it does to children. I don't know if you've heard of the ACE studies, Adverse Childhood Experiences, study put on by Kaiser 20, 30 years ago, and they're just starting to talk about it more now. But when children experience childhood trauma, it haunts them for the rest of their lives, and they develop often very self-injurious ways to cope with that trauma, from smoking and eating and prescription drug or illegal drug misuse to all kinds of different things where they're trying to medicate themselves, or they could end up becoming perpetrators or in an abusive relationship themselves. So there is a third road they can travel where they learn from that negative experience and find a way that to find that belief that they're going to treat people with just much more love than they experienced growing up. But it's a risk when you grow up learning from the master's knee, because abuse is a learned behavior. So I talked to you about some stories about abuse in the physician community. Did you all see the story of the physician, the radiologist, who ran his wife and children off Devil's Slide? There's these words, they're called excited utterances that can be used as evidence if somebody utters something just after an abusive event happens to a police or a witness. And his wife did say in the moment that he was trying to kill them all. And she doesn't want to pursue a criminal case against him, and that's a typical response for a wife that here he's her husband, the father of their children. She wasn't being beaten. Her heart is being engaged here, her empathy, her compassion. What kind of mental turmoil or depression was he going through? But you can be depressed, you can go through turmoil, and you can have anxiety and depression and other mental health issues, and that's totally separate from being an abuser and intending to commit the ultimate act of domestic violence, murder. So I do believe that we should feel compassion for any suffering that somebody has experienced growing up, but we also need to hold them accountable for their actions as an adult. Just recently, this was a case of sexual assault that came out of Newport Beach, hoity-toity fancy Newport Beach, where women were going in for various, laser treatments and trusting the physician, and under anesthesia being sexually assaulted by their physician. Horrific. Isn't it so hard to wrap your mind around this kind of evil? And here is Dr. Martin McNeil with his family of 8. Here he is, being carted off to jail, being found guilty. Yes, he was a lawyer, doctor, lawyer, bishop in his community. But one of the jurors also had a few other names for him: liar, psychopath, murderer. How do you hold those opposite ideas, concepts, characters in your head at the same time? That's how they get away with it. Silicon Valley entrepreneur, G for short, Jabbar Shalal, who was on the Oprah Winfrey Show, written a best-selling book. He sold his company for hundreds of millions of dollars. He donated to a women's shelter, and was on the Charlie Rose Show before Charlie Rose's own fall from grace. And one other thing. Wait, actually two other things, 2 domestic violence convictions. But it wasn't until that second one where he was actually fully held accountable. The first incident that happened, he was caught on video hitting and kicking his girlfriend 117 times, but because of the powerful legal representation he had, he was able to get off the hook that time, but not the last time. But that's how they get away with it, because they've got their own alliances. Such horrific financial abuse that our survivors have experienced. And we talked about that a little bit. Legal abuse, going to court, and sometimes he'll drag her back to court over and over again. Sometimes go after custody of the children, not because he cares about the children. He may have been neglectful or abusive towards them in the past, but now he sees it as a way to look good in the eyes of the judge and to avoid having to pay so much in child support payments, and frankly to stick it to his wife, to get at her where she'll hurt the most, the children. And spiritual abuse, not letting her practice her own faith, or making fun of her for it, ridiculing her for it, not letting the children practice the faith that she wants to teach them, or sowing seeds of disbelief in her religious community, or using the Bible as a weapon to say, you must submit to me. I talked about some of the technological abuse. You can even turn a Tesla into a stalking device. If he has the app, he can follow her in real time.
Tesla.
Yeah. And here's the good news. I've thrown a lot of bad news at you, but the good news is this Family Code 6320. Here's what I've been focused on for the past 12 years. And as of January 2021, there's a law on the books now in family court. It's a start that expands the definition of disturbing the peace by incorporating coercive control into that definition. So emotional, financial, legal, technological abuse, a pattern of isolating, threatening, controlling behavior, all these things now, the totality of the circumstances are being considered now as grounds for a restraining order in family court. And if that's violated, it can become a criminal case. So we're making progress here. So how about some practical tips here as we are moving towards our grand conclusion? What's a way you can start a conversation with somebody that you're concerned about? Here are some things, some language you can have to start the conversation. You can say, I'm concerned for your safety. I'm concerned for your children's safety. I'm concerned that it will only get worse. You don't deserve to be abused, because he'll tell her over and over again. I had a lady who was, after she discovered that her husband, who was a very, very wealthy CEO in Silicon Valley, after she discovered he was having an affair with another man, she found a picture and showed it to him. He put his hands on her throat, strangled her, and said, "Why are you making me do this?" Now, years later, she's having to wear a stent in her heart because of the damage that was done from that one act of strangulation. But he was blaming her even for his act of strangling her. So often women are made to feel like that it's their fault, they brought it on themselves. She shouldn't have said the truth, she shouldn't have confronted him. That guilt, that shame, that self-blame, let's remove that and give it back to the person it belongs to, him, the perpetrator, in some cases her. So you can let her know she doesn't deserve to be abused. No one deserves to be abused. It's not your fault. You're not alone. You can say you're here to help, or you can find someone who can. So you can point them to the website, our website, womensv.org. www.womensv.org. So just some challenges that we've been facing. COVID did a number on all of us. I'm still recovering from COVID myself. So it's not over yet. I mean, people aren't dying from it as often as they did before, but it's still out there, and it turned our ladies into literal prisoners in their home, where there was no escape at work, or for children being trapped there and homeschooled in quotes, where they became these literal prisoners for years. But the flip side of that was I learned to do everything online. So I was able to serve survivors online and even go beyond the borders of Santa Clara and San Mateo County. We get calls from survivors from all over the country now. So that's the good news, the silver lining to the cloud that is COVID, but it depends on them having safe technology, so that remains still a challenge for them. And in the past, when we've been able to supply safe burner phones to them, but that's getting to be more and more of a challenge. So another challenge is, as I said before, doing one-off work with each individual survivor. It's not sustainable, because after my personally serving 1,400 women, I have 1,400 survivors who are still in need of support. And as a mere mortal, no matter how many more staff I hire, there'll be that many more survivors reaching out for help. So what's the solution here? If they're going back into the systems that weren't serving them before and are still not serving them, my solution, my strategy is to go upstream and educate the systems that are in place, supposedly, theoretically, to serve them, but end up inadvertently re-victimizing them because, oh, well, he only strangled you the one time, which was heard in court. Or if it was so bad, why didn't you call the police? Or it can't be that bad because you don't have any blood or broken bones to show for it. So there's all these antiquated notions we have around abuse, and this lack of understanding amongst providers that are still trying to do couples counseling with somebody that is all about controlling, manipulating, and punishing a partner and not presenting the true image of who they truly are. So because I was a teacher before, I'm going back to my roots now, and we're rolling out this whole social media campaign to educate women, not just locally, but across the planet, about what covert abuse looks like, and not to just educate survivors, but providers and the public in general. And another challenge we've been facing is, I talked about the smear campaign. I've been a victim of it myself, so has WomenSV, and it's impacted our ability to even do our fundraising publicly, because who wants to be a target of that kind of attack? So, and how do you raise money when in the old days, it would be having lunch with people or being there in person, but now for safety purposes, because I've received veiled death threats, and because I've been harassed, and even my staff have been harassed as a result of this misinformation campaign that's been circulating. Every time I help a survivor, I make a potential enemy of her partner, should he ever find out. And because we are such a unique population, the women that I serve, their partners are powerful, sophisticated abusers who are well able to mount these smear campaigns to try to squash any help or support that their partners may be receiving. So there is a campaign underway to sort of put WomenSV out of business. But I tell you, we're still alive, we're still here, we're still kicking after 12 years. And we've learned to pivot. And now with this going online and working virtually, working remotely from parts unknown, that's how we're continuing to operate our underground resistance movement. But that's why I'm also so grateful to you if you ever find it in your hearts or your pockets to support our work. With your support, we continue to do this online, the educational outreach for survivors, continuing to train providers, to give each survivor a manual that they can use to create their own story in a way that can be adapted, to tell it in a way that other people can hear, whether it's a financial advisor or a police officer or an attorney or their mother or a friend or themselves. I have created this package that will help survivors to make sense of their story and to tell it in a way that other people can hear it and validate their experience. So I'm looking forward to collaborating and partnering with you all as we go forward. And the challenge I put to you is, the request I put to you is to support our work and to visit womensv.org or to go online if you have it in your heart or in your financial situation to help us. I understand if you don't. But I'd also, here's the challenge I want to leave you with. Can you take what I've shared with you today and share it? Like, you tell a friend and have they tell a friend. Remember, what was that commercial, that shampoo commercial, L'Oreal, whatever it was? You tell a friend, they tell a friend, and you spread the word that covert abuse, coercive control, abuse is not all about always broken bones and bruises. Someone could be in your neighborhood. They could be your next door neighbor. They could be your sister-in-law. They could be your sister. They could be you. But any woman that is intelligent and successful and attractive is a target for a powerful, sophisticated abuser, and it doesn't always leave broken bones or bruises behind to show for it, and it still can take you down and kill you, and that's why we call it the long, slow murder. So if you can spread the word, you'll help keep women, not only women, and some men, but also children, safer, so that they can grow up to have healthy, happy lives themselves. So thank you so much for your kind attention today.
Ruth, you have, I don't know if you have time, just some brief questions.
Yes, please, if you have time.
Have a question?
Yeah, you see that there is the Irish storyteller in me. I went on and on, but I'm happy. I'll be here for as long as you want. If you've got questions, I got answers. I'll try.
Anybody have a question they'd like to ask? Okay, because we were all thinking a bit that the book was a bit far-fetched because she didn't get out and couldn't really defend herself and get away from this abusive husband. But he set all the traps out there for her because he made everybody think she was a little crazy, I guess is what he did.
Yes.
Pretty much what you said.
Yeah, well, you know what happened when they went to Thailand, right? Like each time she tried to escape, oh, my poor wife, here he is. He's planted the seeds already. And that's like your reaction is the reaction of the average innocent civilian. When they don't understand everything that's going on behind the scenes, they just see the surface. So if it's so bad, I would never put up with that. Why don't you just leave? If it's a dysfunctional relationship or an unhealthy relationship, you can say, I'm out of here. But when somebody is threatening to kill you, threatening to destroy your reputation, your career, take the children away from you, to ruin you, it's so much harder. And when they have the means to do that, and they sail under that camouflage of that positive public image, and when they've been isolated, and that's something else that, look how isolated the heroine was in this story. Who could she reach out to for support? That friend in the end, right, who helped her say, and, I was there with you, and we saw him wave from the window, and how wonderful to have that support. Not all our women do.
No. I remember when I first met you, gave a talk, and you talked about a woman in Palo Alto, I believe, who was taken from a different state or something by her husband, who was either a doctor or an attorney or something. And he pretty much had a house like in the book, where it was a beautiful home, but it had security gates all around, and he put surveillance on her car, and I don't know how, pretty much what you were saying. Can you give us a relatable story of somebody in our area that you could mention, just give us a little bit of background on something you've actually found or learned about, and also how do women contact you? I still don't know exactly how that works.
Oh yeah, yes. Thank you for that. Well, let me. If you want to take a note, it's info@womensv.org if you want to reach out to me. I think that's the best way to reach me. But a relatable story, there's so many, and let me...
stories.
Yeah, let me share. Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, I want to hear this story.
Yeah. So a lady who was married to a very powerful person in our community, in Santa Clara County, who had a very, very successful business. He kept her a prisoner in his home. She had a sports injury, and she was kept in her bedroom for 2 years and doped up on a Valium, and very hard for her to reach out for help. There was a night where, he was a therapist, a very successful therapist, and there was a night when she had enough, and she told him, I want a divorce. I'm tired of living like this, and I want out. And he kept her up all night, and he threatened her with a knife, chased her around the house, broke plates in the kitchen, so that the house was a shambles. She was finally able to call the police. And the police, when they showed up, he got, just as I alluded to before, this has happened so many times, but in this particular case, he got to the police out in the driveway before she did and said, "Thank God you're here. My wife is having another one of her psychotic meltdowns. I'm a therapist, and I do believe that for her safety and frankly for the sake of myself and our children, that she should be on a psychiatric hold. Will you please help me to help her?" And doesn't that sound authentic? And here he is, calm and concerned, and getting to the police first. it's that whole first to market wins mentality they have. The police go in and they see her beside herself because she's been kept up all night, sleep deprived. She's been terrorized, threatened with a knife. The knife is on the counter. There's broken plates. She's trying to explain, but she's not coming across too coherently in the moment because of everything because she's been terrorized. So she's a little beside herself, and they're calling her hysterical, and she's the one that gets her hands slapped in restraints and taken off to a locked unit. And then that was that phrase that I put on the slide when he came to visit her, and she said to him, "Why did you do that?" And he told her, "Because I can."
Oh my God. What was the end of that story?
Yeah, what's the end? How'd she get out?
Fortunately, she did over time get out, and so many of our survivors, when they have these pieces in place of support, like, oh, do you need to reach out to a financial advisor? Let's prepare your safety plan. I have this manual that is how to tell your story. I have a safety plan and a strategic exit plan. All these pieces in place. So for ladies like her, they were able to sort of to put these pieces in place to gather their village, build their allies. She's out now. And she's got her own career. She's gone back to her career. She's very successful at it. She met a wonderful man, and she's reconnected with her children because he had turned them against her for a while. But now they're back on the same page, and they understand. They see the truth is now because the mask slipped with them as they become adults. The children that he had turned against her, now they're starting to see who he truly is, and they've come back to her in the end. So that is like one of the sort of the reasons why I do this work, to see the hope that gets generated in women as they reach out to us, and then they find that we understand, we validate, we believe them, and we're often the first place. It's like an outpost in the wilderness that come on in, have a cup of tea, let me hear your story. And then they get that support that they need, and then that helps them gather the strength they need. And then we've got all kinds of like TikTok videos and Instagram and Pinterest posts that they can tap into to cheer them on along the way. So with that, and then the support group where they feel that they're not alone anymore. They share their story with other women and get validated through that, create a community. So they start to build their own village, and then that's where the hope lies, as they start to see freedom, that there's a possibility, that there are resources, they're not alone anymore, they're not crazy, it's not their fault. They give the shame and the blame back to their abuser, and they start to take their power back, and then that's when so many of them move on and create their own lives. So that's the beauty of it.
What happened to her husband? Didn't anything happen to him?
Unfortunately not. Unfortunately not, and that's such a good question. And when you have power and money, look what you can get away with. Look at Bill Cosby, sent to prison and now out of prison and off on a technicality and planning his next tour. And how many women had to come forward with Weinstein before anything happened?
Well,
Thank you so much.
thank you very much, Ruth.
Yes.
Really helped us a lot.
Thank
It
you.
was
My
understanding
pleasure.
the world out there that hopefully none of us are experiencing.
Thank you. Well, bless your heart. Thank you so much.